starting with Aztec sacrifices, normalization of violence in Aztec society, and this is by actually let me. Yes, this is from M Laser History. Very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, in the course, in the course of human history, almost every human culture has practiced human sacrifice to some extent. Whether in the literal sense of ritualistically killing them in a public and visible way, or the more subtle forms, like say, allowing the old and infirm to perish during a historic pandemic because the mythical economy must go on. In any case, for some reason, the Aztec version of human sacrifice has become one of the most infamous and fascinating examples of this kind of a very common human pattern. And perhaps it's because of just the utter ostentatiousness of it. Like just ripping people's hearts out and like tossing them down a step pyramid to I don't know, like sweeping drums or whatever. Maybe it's just because it was very well documented compared to the more like archaeological evidence we tend to have of from other cultures. But in either case, I guess we'll be learning about that.
Almost every corner of the world, human sacrifices, mostly based on religion, did happen
just
at
like
some
I
point
said.
in history. The most treasured thing a human can give up is his life, and therefore, in the eyes of many throughout history, human sacrifice is the most valuable sacrifice someone can offer to a god or god.
Yeah, I mentioned that it was very common, but I didn't. Well, yeah. The retainer sacrifice of ancient Egypt, like wasn't that when, like the emperor or the pharaoh, I guess. I mean, when the pharaoh died, they would like kill all his servants and retinue so they could serve him in the afterlife, kind of stuff. But yeah, so we got plenty of other things. Like the Carthaginian child sacrifices, didn't know about that. I think the Shang and Zhao dynasty slave funerary sacrifices are similar to the ancient Egypt ones, where it's just your master dies, so you gotta die along with him to go join him in the afterlife. That's something actually I think I only know that specific one because of I don't remember his name, but this guy has been doing like a multi-part series on like the fucking ancient China history iceberg, which I need to finish. It's like I think part 4 came out a while ago. And I think he finished it, so I really have no excuse at this point. But yeah, similar things from Hindus and West Africa.
However, despite the fact that human sacrifices did happen at some point throughout history all across the world, no culture brought the act of human sacrifices to such a large extent as the Aztecs did. The Aztecs were a pre-Columbian civilization living in today's central Mexico. The word Aztec is misleading as it can refer to multiplicities of peoples and polities, but when people use it today, they mostly just mean the Mexica people whose capital was the city of Tenochtitlan. The Mexica, by the time of the early 16th century, when Cortés arrived to Mexico, were the hegemon of a triple alliance that ruled over a large polity we today call the Aztec Empire. Therefore, we often use the words Aztec and Mexica as interchangeable, even though they're really not. The word Aztec can refer to many different people groups, like, for example, everyone within the Aztec Empire, or everyone who spoke the Nahuatl language, or everyone pertaining to the tribes that migrated from the north to central Mexico, of whom the Mexica people were just one tribe. Due to this ambiguous definition of the word Aztec, it is important to more specifically define the words that I will use in this video. I will use the word Mexica to refer to the people from Tenochtitlan who ruled over what we call the Aztec Empire. I will use the word Aztec as a catch-all word for the religion, because that's what we call it today, the Aztec religion. And also, I will use the word to refer to the polity of the Aztec Empire as a whole and the people within it, even though keep in mind, some of these people were not always happy to be in the empire, and they often saw themselves as different from the ruling Mexica. Lastly,
I mean that's very common for any empire, right? Like I'm sure that plenty of people in the Roman Empire or the British Empire were, well, clearly in the British case, they were not happy to be part of the empire. That's not surprising
Use
in
the
the
word
least.
Nahua to refer to all the speakers of the Nahuatl language, of whom the Mexica were just one peoples. Also, to confuse things even more, the Aztec Empire didn't only have Nahuatl speakers within it, and not all Nahuatl speakers were within the Aztec Empire. Therefore, if I want to talk about everyone who lived in pre-Columbian Central Mexico, I'll just say people in Central Mexico. I know it all sounds very confusing right now, but
Well, I mean,
pre-Columbian Central Mexico.
this is a very important disambiguation. Is if you were trying to explain this sort of on the fly, I feel like that'd be a lot more confusing than just setting us down at the start and just laying down all the this is this, that's that kind of thing.
Mexico was anything
No,
but
I'm not gonna be taking notes of all that. I'm
so
just
to understand how a
gonna
civilized
summarize it
society
all,
could create an
as Aztec is a
institution
very
so
ambiguous
prevalent
term.
with human sacrifices, we must first understand the religion that often drove the Mexicas and other Central Mexican peoples' need for human sacrifices. Due to the often dubious nature of sources we have about the Aztec Empire, its people, and their religion, there are multiple versions of various religious myths, including the creation myth. It is also probable that the people living in central Mexico, who largely shared their religious beliefs with the Mexica, had all slightly different versions of gods, myths, and rituals. Such a thing is not unusual for polytheistic religions, and we see a similar thing in ancient Greece, for example. With that said, there are two main Aztec creation myths. I will present one of them here, and you can watch the other in this TED-Ed video. The people of central Mexico believed they lived in the time of the fifth iteration of the sun. Every previous iteration of the sun ended by the destruction of the sun and the human race. The humans that are alive now in the fifth iteration were created by the god Quetzalcoatl. He used the bones of the humans who lived during the fourth iteration of the sun and his own blood to create the current humans. The fifth sun itself was created by the god Huitzilopochtli, who sacrificed himself to become the sun so he could nourish the world. However, Huitzilopochtli's sister, Coyolxauhqui, the goddess of the moon, hated Huitzilopochtli and wanted to destroy him. As such, every night when the moon rises, trying to destroy the sun, Huitzilopochtli fights off his sister, ultimately winning and creating the next day. With that said, Huitzilopochtli needs the help of humans through the means of human sacrifices, auto-sacrifice, and religious rituals to keep successfully fighting off his sister every night. Whether you choose to go with this creation myth or the other one I already mentioned, or with the myriad of other variations on these two creation myths, it doesn't really matter, as all of them have certain central themes that don't change. Same goes for the Aztec religion as a whole. There might be sources with different variations on myths and gods, but the main themes largely remain the same. These main themes being 1. The gods used their own blood to create humans in one way or another, and therefore the humans are indebted by blood to the gods. 2. The sun needs human sacrifices so that there is a next day. This does not, however, mean there has to be a sacrifice for each new day. It's not like a daily payment or something.
Thank God.
3. Human sacrifice is the most venerated way to show proper honor to the gods, and therefore, if you want something very important from them, like for example rain for the crops from Tlaloc, the god of water, you have to give him a human sacrifice. 4. If there are no human sacrifices and no proper honor is shown to the gods, not only will the sun lose to the moon, but also the humans will be destroyed. This, for example, happened in the second iteration of the sun when Tezcatlipoca, the god of rulers, priests, and war, was disgusted by the impiety of the humans and turned them all into monkeys. These main factors of the Aztec religion created the basis upon which the central Mexican societies built their institution that normalized the killing of humans. Majority of people today, when someone talks about the quote-unquote Aztec sacrifices, picture the most common type of sacrifice, and that is the cutting out of the heart and presenting it to the gods. However, in reality, there were many different sacrificial rituals. Some involved drowning, others burning or forced starvation, and some even involved elaborate ritualistic enacting of a predetermined battle where the unarmed sacrificial victim was killed by several heavily armed soldiers. Plus, different gods and festivals, along with different circumstances like a drought or flooding, required different rituals. The victims of these rituals also varied. Most numerous were enemies captured in a war, but slaves, regular citizens, and even sometimes noblemen were also sacrificed in certain circumstances. The age and gender of the victims also mattered, as, for example, Tlaloc, the god of rain and water, required child sacrifices for the rains to come, while Toki, the mother goddess, required a female sacrifice. Before I mention any details about the quote-unquote Aztec human sacrifices, what must be said is that, unless directly specified, I'm not only talking about the Mexica here. Yes, many of the sources that talk about sacrifices in detail are about the Mexica, but my presentation of an Aztec human sacrifice is a general overview of the type of sacrifice that was conducted, as far as we know, in most of late pre-Columbian central Mexico. We know from some sources that the various Nahuas and other peoples of central Mexico did share very similar religious beliefs, customs, and did conduct similar human sacrifices. As one Nahua put it, before them, the gods, we kiss the ground, we bleed, we pay our debts to the gods, offer incense, make human sacrifices, we live by the grace of the gods. Therefore, it would be reasonable to think that the details we have about the Mexica human sacrifices are similar to that of the sacrifices conducted by other Nahuas and Central Mexican peoples, especially when it comes to the most common type of sacrifice, the extraction of the heart. Imagine you're a warrior, captured in a battle by the enemy who promptly brought you to their city temple to sacrifice you. This is not unusual. In fact, the society we live in has created a system of ritualistic wars called the Flower Wars, one of the purposes of which was to capture enemy soldiers for sacrifices. The battles of these Flower Wars occurred on predetermined plains with predetermined army sizes. The point of the battle wasn't to kill the enemy, but to capture as many enemies as you can so that you can sacrifice them in your city temple. People would still die during these battles, but not as many as in an actual war. By the way, a bit of a side note, the Mexica and other Central Mexican peoples could also wage normal war. There's a common misconception that when the Spanish arrived, the Mexica lost so easily to them because they tried to fight them in the style of the Flower War and tried to capture them rather than killing them. But that's not true. The Mexica...
Yeah, I've never heard that before. I've never done too much research into this. Otherwise I wouldn't need to be watching this video myself. But yeah, very, very interesting how they. Yeah, well, to be fair, ritualized warfare is not super uncommon. I guess just the specific type of doing it for like freaking. The ritualized human sacrifices. It's unique, I think.
Were fully capable of waging a quote-unquote ordinary war of conquest. Of course, when possible, they would capture some enemies for sacrifices, but that wasn't their goal. Their goal was to win. And as Ross Hazing states in his book Aztec Warfare, as demonstrated by the use of ambushes, circumvention of battling armies, and firing of enemy temples and cities, the Aztec leadership was not overly concerned with how victories were won in wars of conquest. If needed for victory, the Mexica were not against employing the tactics of a total war. Anyways, back to sacrificing you. You go through a series of rituals and cleansing to prepare you to be sacrificed, after which you're taken to the foot of the temple. As you're waiting at the foot of the pyramid, you're not there alone. Depending what deity you're being sacrificed for, or during which type of ceremony you're being sacrificed, there could be any number of people waiting there with you. These could be other fellow warriors captured in the battle, or some slaves bought from the market, or some local citizens that were chosen to be sacrificed along with you. For now, let's say there are some local citizens there ready to be sacrificed along with you and a bunch of other captured warriors. Some local people walk up to their fellow citizens waiting to be sacrificed and tell them their personal stories and problems and politely ask them to bring these issues up to the
Hilarious. My video's
gods
not
once
been
they're
doing great.
sacrificed. The
Yeah,
citizens
Please tell the algorithm gods to look kindly upon my videos. Yeah, I'm sure they'll. I'm sure some of the level of requests made back in those days were like on that level of ridiculousness, of pettiness.
ready to be sacrificed listen carefully to their fellow citizens' problems and in return are being given great praise and admiration by their peers.
Yeah, it does. Because I've been wondering what must be going through someone's mind when something like this is happening. I mean, I'm sure for the captured soldiers and slaves, it's probably a lot less fun. But yeah, I was thinking like I mean, wouldn't I mean as a citizen, wouldn't you be a little put out by having your whole life ended so well? I guess not unceremoniously, very very ceremoniously. But I mean, if if this is how it went down a lot, and I guess they're very much like, well, we're just ending this life and going on to the other life. So it must not have been. Hopefully it wasn't as terrible as a Westerner like myself would see it.
Sacrificed for your city is
Or
given great
really,
honor
not even a Westerner. It's just a modern day person is at this point.
in your society, and the family you leave behind could even be able to move up social ranks thanks to your sacrifice. With that said, you, in your current situation, are given little honor. Sure, there is honor in being sacrificed, but there is little honor in being sacrificed by the enemy to the enemy's gods. However, being sacrificed
Yeah,
is the
how's that
nature
gonna
of life.
how's that gonna work? I mean, I guess because I was gonna say like, I mean, if you're being sacrificed to the enemy's gods, they're not gonna put in a great word for them, are you? But I guess these guys are just the food or whatever, and these guys are gonna be supposed to be the was it intermissionary or something like that? Like, they're supposed to be the ones who are sending the people's wishes and prayers to the gods, I guess.
For you. It is how it is, and it has always been this. And even though there's no honor in being sacrificed by the enemy, there is still huge dishonor in not being sacrificed when you have already been chosen and prepared to be sacrificed. Not being
That's very
sacrificed
convenient.
at this point is worse than being sacrificed by your enemy to their gods. This is why when Cortez's expedition freed some sacrificial victims, they indignantly rejected the offer of release and demanded to be sacrificed. As one 16th century Nahua put it, it was never found out whether any one of those that were chosen to be sacrificed had fled, for to flee seemed a thing unworthy of men that presented such a great majesty as this idol, so as not to be held as cowardly and fearfully with perpetual infamy, not only in this land but also in his own, and so they wished first to die to earn eternal fame, because they held this to be glory and happy end. However, with that said, it is also clear that not all people viewed it this way. Dying is still dying, and
Yes.
some people did not want to die even if it brought honor to them and their family. That is why, when some captive lost his strength, fainted, only went continually throwing himself on the ground, they, the priests, just dragged him to the altar. But when one made an effort, he went strong of heart, he went shouting, he did not go downcast, he did not go spiritless, he went extolling, he went exalting his city. Whether you choose to go to your sacrifice at the top of the pyramid with a strong conviction and a head held high, or by throwing yourself on the ground and shouting is up to you, but it does go to show that there were people in pre-Columbian Central Mexican society that did not want to be sacrificed and had to be dragged to the altar unwillingly. Nevertheless, climbing the very steep steps of the pyramid, which were bloodied by the corpses of the people sacrificed before you, whose lifeless bodies were thrown down the steps next to you, must have been a very daunting task even for the most devout of people. looking down from the pyramid, you see a great gathering of people singing ritualistic songs specific to that particular sacrificial event. Many of the people in the crowd also participated in auto-sacrifice, which involves the letting of blood for the gods. It must have been truly a fervent spectacle. We also know that the Central Mexican peoples used hallucinogenic drugs, and we're pretty sure they were somehow used in ceremonies, mostly by the nobility and the priests, but the exact extent of the use of drugs in sacrificial ceremonies is unknown. As one historian said, despite claims that corrosive chemicals were extensively used in Aztec culture, they are very rarely mentioned in accounts of sacrificial ceremonies. Therefore, we don't really know the extent of the use of these drugs in ceremonies. With that said, keep in mind, as you're trying to climb the steep, bloody steps of the pyramid, with the bodies of the sacrificial victims before you falling down the steps, and the citizens behind you singing while bloodletting, you and the priest sacrificing you could also be hallucinating.
I mean, I guess that
Once
would
you make it to the
have
top
taken
of the
the edge
pyramid,
off.
one of Cortez's conquistadors tells us the men and women who were to be sacrificed to their gods were thrown on their backs and of their own accord remained perfectly still. Again, this probably goes back to the fact that some people went to the sacrifice with their heads held high, with no fear, with the belief that they are doing the right thing. However, there most certainly were others who had to be held down on the sacrificial stone, as attested to by one source which stated that the 5 priests of sacrifice followed them. They were to hold down the feet, hands, and heads of the victims. Each prisoner they took to the sacrificial place, when they had forced him to stand upon the stone, which was the figure and likeness of the sun, they threw him upon his back. One took him by the right arm, another by the left, one by his left foot, another by his right, while the 5th priest tied his neck with a cord and held him down so that he could not move. It is clear, again, that some people had to be held down for the sacrifice, as they presumably did not want to be sacrificed. Once the heart was extracted by a priest with an extremely sharp obsidian knife, it was presented to the specific idol of the god the ceremony was for, and afterwards the heart was often burnt, with the ashes being kept as an important relic. The now lifeless body was then tossed down the steep steps of the pyramid, and preparations were made for the next person in line to be sacrificed. The bodies that piled up at the bottom of the pyramid were ceremoniously butchered, and the various parts of the body were used in multiple ways. The skull was put on a skull rack called tzompantli, other parts of the body were given to the zoo animals to eat, and some parts of the body, on occasions when the victim was captured in battle, were given to the warrior that captured the victim, and he would ceremoniously eat it with his family. This heart extraction sacrifice I talked about is the quote most common type of sacrifice, and it was practiced by all the major Central Mexican peoples during the period of the Aztec Empire. The second sacrifice I'm going to be talking about is, as far as we know, specific to Tenochtitlan and the Mexica people. The preparations for this sacrificial ceremony started a year before the actual ceremony in the month of Toxcatl, which is roughly the month of May. During this month, a young male was chosen to be the impersonator of Tezcatlipoca, the god of rulers, priests, war, and a bunch of other things. This chosen young man was either a slave or a war captive. Once chosen to be the impersonator, the man was taught various skills like how to play the flute, sing, and speak in the manner befitting of a god. He was also painted completely black, barring his eyes, and adorned with precious jewelry and cotton embroidered clothes. Then, for a year, the young man would walk around the city of Tenochtitlan playing the flute, smoking tobacco, and interacting with the people as the earthly manifestation of the god Tezcatlipoca. It is said that no one could refuse the request of the impersonator, and several times he would even meet with the Mexica ruler. The young man was also ritually wed to 4 maidens with
Yeah, that's an interesting way of doing. It's kind of like the jester, I guess, practice in, like, medieval and maybe early modern Europe. Yeah, it's like another very common practice in cultures where you create a, like, role that's allowed to do whatever, and then hopefully, they use that to, um, how to say, convey the messages of the people to the ruling class in a way that the ruling class is like at least is supposed to be amenable to. I don't know how effective it was in this time, but yeah, it's like a very common practice, I guess.
Whom he spent a lot of time. When the year passed, on the same day in May that he was chosen to be the impersonator of Tezcatlipoca, the young man walked up the steps of the pyramid, broke his flute in half, and made preparations to be sacrificed. As always, a great crowd of people would gather in front of the temple, sing songs, and participate in auto-sacrifice. The priests could only sacrifice the impersonator once he gave them the approval. This way, the impersonator of Tezcatlipoca chose his own time when to die. Once dead, the body of the impersonator was flayed, and the flesh was distributed among the nobles of the city and eaten. His skull, as always, was put on its zompantli. Also, during the ceremony, other people and other gods impersonators were sacrificed, and the next year's impersonator of Tezcatlipoca was chosen, and so the cycle continued. As stated before, there were many other types of sacrificial ceremonies than just the two I talked about, but hopefully this closer look at these two sacrifices gave you an idea of how these ceremonies looked like. Now that we have discussed why the sacrifices happened and how the sacrifices happened, let's talk about why the sacrifices happened. Yes, you heard right. So far we only mentioned that the Aztec religion created the basis upon which the Central Mexican societies built their institutions that normalized the killing of humans. But religion wasn't the only factor for why it happened. It was undoubtedly a major aspect that created the tools, the means, and the basis for sacrifices to occur, but according to some historians, it wasn't the only reason. Historians have come up with 3 ideas for why sacrifices were so prevalent in central Mexico, one of which we already discussed, religion, but there could have also been a political and ecological aspect to it. First, the ecological argument. This argument focuses on the cannibalism aspect of human sacrifices and was proposed by historian Michael Harner and later revised by Marvin Harris. The main core of the argument claims that cannibalism was a dietary necessity in central Mexico since the area lacked in any kind of domesticable large herbivores. This meant that pre-Columbian Central Mexican society was deficient in essential amino acids, and the only way to get them was through cannibalism.
Okay, I've never heard that before. I mean, I feel like every region, of course, is unique and has its own specific problems. I mean, I feel like there was similar situations that happened with like other cultures. I don't think they had to resort to cannibalism. They ate like plants, certain types of plants. But maybe, like I said, maybe the unique situation of Central America did not allow for those sorts of things, or just the cultural evolution didn't favor or never capitalized on plant-based amino acids and proteins and other sort of essential nutrients. But yeah, I mean, interesting idea that they had to do the cannibalism. Like there was no other option. But I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking about it as if it's like a modern day person trying to do apologetics for an existing and extant culture's practices. But I don't know. I guess if it's a historian trying to make sense of a long dead culture, the chances that this is some sort of weird agenda being pushed are probably a lot lower.
This is why many of the sacrificial rituals we talked about involve some kind of cannibalism, and why the religious institution that normalized the killing.
I mean, for that to be a reasonable possibility, we would need to know how much human meat was in the average Central American's diet. I mean, if it's just like a thing you did every other month or whatever, then I mean, that obviously it doesn't really. It's probably not dietary supplement
suffering of humans was retained in the society. This theory came under a lot of attack by other historians who argued that there were plenty of huntable animals in
Yeah, that
central
too.
Mexico, like salamanders, fowls, armadillos, weasels, etc. And there are also accounts of the Central Mexican people raising large numbers of dogs to sell and eat. Plus,
Yeah, and that too. I mean,
nutrients
for
needed for
people who saw my video about the pre-contact dogs of Native America, they did use dogs as basically feed animals. Is that the right word for it? Yeah, they ate dogs. They raised them as livestock and whatnot.
from meat could also be found in local plants like the leaves
Yeah,
and
that
seeds
too.
of
That too.
amaranth. There is also a case to be made that the cannibalism aspect of Central Mexican sacrifices we find in the sources could be overblown due to the nature of the sources, but more on the nature of the sources later in the video. Second, we'll look at the political argument. The political argument was championed by historians Godfrey Conrad and Arthur Demarest. This argument, rather than trying to explain the practice of human sacrifices in Central Mexico as a whole, focuses more on the rulers of the Aztec Empire, the Mexica. This is because even though, as discussed, human sacrifices were prevalent in all Central Mexican societies, it can be argued that the Mexica brought the scale of human sacrifice to an extent previously unseen in Central Mexico. From the sources we have, it seems like the Mexica sacrificed way more people than any other Central Mexican society did, and they may have even used these extensive sacrifices as a scare tactic against their enemies and to keep their vassals in check. The political explanation argues that the Mexica, when they became the hegemon of the Triple Alliance that formed the Aztec Empire, created an imperial cult around their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, that imposed on the Mexica the religious duty of warfare, conquest, and sacrifices. In essence, the religion of the Mexica was manipulated for political reasons to create the basis upon which the policy of imperialism could be conducted more freely and efficiently.
I mean, that sounds
The
very
religion
familiar.
that already practiced human sacrifices, but not to such an extent, was altered to fit the political agenda of expansion and conquest. Through the religious demand for more sacrifices, the Mexica could easily conduct and justify their frequent wars and subjugations, which, on top of expanding their economic and political power, also gave them a steady supply of the much needed sacrificial victims. The political argument has also come under attack from some historians who believe it overshadows the pure religious importance of human sacrifices in the Mexica society.
I mean, I guess it depends on the worldview of the person speaking. But I mean, of the because it depends on the perspective that you're looking at it through. But I mean, oftentimes, I mean, religion in pretty much every society and culture and whatnot gets twisted. I mean, it's very, very easy to twist religion towards the purposes of whatever are the primary state actors in society. Whoever has the control of the reins of power, they pretty much always just use religion as a kind of you have the opiate of the masses for in the form of entertainment and other sorts of diversionary activities, but then religion is kind of like the justifier to the masses. Religion is how a society contextualizes and makes sacred, I guess, the practices and let's say objectives of a society or civilization or state or whatever. I feel like trying to put the pure religious importance of it as the primary means of it. It's kind of like, I mean, honestly, it feels a little naive. It feels a little idealistic. Whereas the politics, the real politic of it is way more way more just. I mean, that's the world we live in. Like, I don't know. I mean, it was like 500 years ago in another culture, completely separated from the whole old world. So maybe they actually were more pure in their uh, approach and understanding religion. But I mean, I would assume that the real politic of it was probably the more the real mover and shaker of the of all this. But yeah, I'm definitely coming at it from a very, I guess, political perspective.
Herbert
From a
Burhan
perspective that centers the politics of it. I mean, you can already see from some of my notes, like, I'm kind of, these are kind of pushing in that direction of that. Let me actually change, because I think having seen this, or having seen more of the video, I think I can contextualize a little bit more what I meant when I wrote that down.
states that we are asked to accept the intensification of human sacrifice and cannibalism as rationale because it led to Mexica prosperity and hegemony.
Okay,
The
no, that is
Mexica leaders
not.
were not blinded by superstition into ordering vicious and brutal acts, but were rather pursuing eminently rational, if somewhat short-sighted, dictates of realpolitik. We may be able to recognize the rational shape of the actions of Mexica leaders, but we do not know whether they considered their actions in terms of the reasons we infer.
Yeah, it's not a reason. That's not a meaningful critique of the idea. Like, I don't think the people putting forth this idea are necessitating that they must have been thinking about in these terms. I mean, we need look no further than modern day realpolitik to see that there are always true believers within the upper echelons of society, and there are people who understand the cynical actual reasons behind why they're doing these sorts of things. Why we have to go after the Iraqis for their weapons of mass destructions, even though they did not, even though they were not the ones behind the attack on our World Trade Center. Like, it's a good rationale for it, and I'm sure, when for example, the Bush administration pulled that switcheroo on the, I mean, not just American populace, but the whole Western sphere. I'm sure there are people within the administration who believed, I mean, not necessarily that the Iraqis specifically did, but more just, like, they're all Arabs, they're I guess to put it in bluntly, all inferior to us. So who cares whether we use? Oh, well, I guess at that point that's really blending, really mixing the differences between the so-called true believers and the cynics. But I mean, point being that it does not. I cannot think of a less reasonable criticism of the realpolitik explanation for the sacrifices than how do we don't know the intent of the priests and elites and nobles of the society. Like, do they actually believe what they're doing or not? I mean, I guess these are just people. I mean, the more reasonable interpretations, these critiques are just coming from people who just don't believe in that kind of materialist analysis of politics and history. So they're just coming up with these kind of spurious, what's the word, like, basically non sequiturs.
They may have just been acting the way they did because of increasing religious fanaticism, which was correlated with the expansion of the empire but did not dictate
I mean,
it.
yeah, it could be a
I'm
chicken and
not
egg scenario
convinced by
like
the
that, but
ecological argument. I also believe religion had a very strong role to play in why, essentially, the killing of humans in a ritualistic manner was so normalized in
I
the
mean, I guess to sort of round off the edges or sand off the edges of my critique of their critique. I mean, yes, it is a lot easier to do that kind of cultural religious manipulation if you yourself have drank the Kool-Aid and you actually believe it. Then you don't have to fake it. You can just actually live it. So I mean, in that sense, it's more of a, I guess, a systemic kind of approach. This is the way where it's more like the this is how the culture itself as if it were a living thing itself, kind of like justifies and promotes and makes easier the imperialistic expansion into surrounding areas and cultures and whatnot. Even if this the same way that like your lungs are not aware of the role they play in keeping your body alive. They're just doing their own thing according to their own inner functioning or whatever. But if you could talk to your lungs and ask them why they're doing what they're doing, they probably would not understand it in terms of I'm doing a very important role in keeping this body alive. They just think of it as I breathe in, I breathe out. That's that's what I do. There's to try and phrase it as me doing it for some other reason is kind of diminishing my great expansion and contracting purpose, whatever.
the societies of Central Mexico. However, the Aztec Empire, and Central Mexico as a whole, was quite a diverse place, and the reasons for human sacrifices by one peoples could have been different from other peoples. All of them definitely had a religious reason, but when it comes to the powerful states, such as that of the Mexica, I don't think religion was the only factor that drove the sacrificial rituals.
Yeah.
There must have been some kind of political involvement. Lastly,
I mean,
I
otherwise,
also
where
don't
would
think
you?
the sacrifice
Because I mean, if you don't have the the capital, like the social and the financial capital from the movers and shakers in society, like how are you going to keep funding and sustaining your temples and priestly like class and whatnot? Like that kind of requires buy-in from the people with the money and the food and stuff to do that. And like they're not gonna just do that shit out of the kindness of their heart. Like if they decide like sorry, we got more important things to do, like the money faucet gets cut off and you're like up shit's creek without a paddle. Like no amount of religious fanaticism is going to save you when you don't have, like, when rent comes due and you can't pay for your step pyramid and they repossess it. Like it's
of humans was as normalized in Central Mexican society as much as we may think it was. On top of the sources mentioning that being sacrificed was an honor, something a person would want to do, there are also snippets showing that some people did not want to be sacrificed, as I have demonstrated when talking about the specific rituals. There are also hints in the mythology that not everyone in the Central Mexican society were happy with the sacrifices. For example, the god Quetzalcoatl is mentioned in multiple myths as being against human sacrifices. To quote,
all right. Based Quetzalcoatl, I knew there was a reason they made him look like that in Fate, in the Fate series, the big boobied kind of bimbo-esque energy. I mean, I got good guy Quetzalcoatl.
it is told and related that many times during the life of Quetzalcoatl, sorcerers tried to ridicule him into making the human payment, into taking human lives as payment/tribute. But he always refused. He did not consent because he greatly loved his subjects. There were also many people in the society who probably never thought much of the human sacrifices and or, even though against it, went with it because that was the nature of life for them. As historian Camilla Townsend put it, surely there were many more of the Mexica who simply never thought much about it. Like people in so many times and places who choose not to see the pain inflicted on other people when it is more convenient.
I mean,
not
that almost goes without saying.
Therefore, be
Such a human
inappropriate
universal.
to talk about all the Central Mexican peoples or even all the Mexica as being completely fine with human sacrifices. But at the
Yeah,
same
whenever I hear these kinds of what do they call it, like disclaimers, I'm always like, yeah, this is probably I was like, why do we need to hear that? Like, who thought every single human being in this entire region across like multiple generations were like all the same opinion and beliefs about something as intense as human sacrifice? But then, I remember there are people like that who either because they're idiots or they're liars that would totally try to maintain there was some sort of singular blanket opinion or stance on the matter. So much as it pains me to accept it, these kind of disclaimers are necessary. Otherwise I'm sure people in the comments would be like, oh, actually, and it'd be like totally just taken away from the actual interesting content of the video.
time, it is definitive that human sacrifices were normalized to a large extent and seen as a fact of life for the majority of the population. Lastly, now we come to the problem with everything I just talked about. Basically, all we know about the people in the Aztec Empire and the surrounding areas come from mostly colonial era sources. These sources include accounts of conquistadors, general colonizers, Nahua songs, and books written by Nahuas or Nahuatl-speaking peoples, but not only them, which are called codices. The Nahuas wrote codices before the Spanish arrival, but the majority of them did not survive as they were extensively burned by the Spanish and the Catholic Church. Today,
Damn, looks like they
there
have
are
fucking
only
flamethrowers.
3 complete pre-colonial Mexica codices, and even these 3 codices are being questioned by historians whether they truly were made in the pre-colonial era, as they do have some similarities to colonial codices. Nevertheless, since we have only 3 surviving, possibly pre-colonial Mexica codices, today's historians have to rely a lot on colonial sources. You probably know that relying on colonial sources isn't the best, as accounts of conquistadors and colonizers were often biased against the natives to justify their conquest.
Yes.
For example,
political reasons. I mean, I'm sure those priests were not burning these codices just because they were, heretical texts from some barbarian religion. I'm sure they've also had some very important political purposes in basically destroying the natives' culture and making it much easier to totally replace it with the Christian religion.
Cortez's first letter to the Spanish King Charles V was found to be heavily edited by a royal committee before it got to the king. The committee wanted to present Cortez's actions in Mexico the most favorably for the Spanish crown, and therefore they altered parts of it before showing it to the king. This existent bias is why I mentioned the cannibalism in our sources could be overplayed. It is also due to this Spanish bias why a lot of the numbers about how many people were being sacrificed by the Mexica or Central Mexican peoples in general are sometimes laughably over-exaggerated. To give you an example, when the main pyramid of Tenochtitlan, known today as Templo Mayor, was refurbished and reworked in 1487, a giant 4-day dedication ceremony was held at the top of the temple with 4 separate sacrificial altars. Some of the Spanish colonial sources state that during this ceremony, 80,400 people were sacrificed, which is roughly 14 people a minute, or 3.5 people per minute per altar for 96 hours straight. This is obviously logistically impossible, and such a high number is certainly a Spanish fabrication. Most historians today put the number of sacrifices for the dedication of the temple somewhere between 4 to 20,000, which must be stated
still
even
insane.
at its lower and is still a very sizable number for just a
It's
single
a damn
event.
stadium right there.
According to one source, the smell of blood was so strong in the city that it became unendurable to the people. Overall, you can clearly see the problematic nature of using colonial sources. However, as always, there's much more nuance to this statement. For example, as already mentioned, there are colonial codices that were written by Nahuas. This would, in theory, be great, as we get their own opinion, but there's more caveats to that. For example, as mentioned at the start of the video, not all Nahuas were the Mexica or were within the Aztec Empire. Also, not all Nahuas liked the Mexica or other Nahuas, and it is sometimes hard in the colonial period to separate the various Nahuas from each other, as the Spanish, and sometimes even the various Nahuas themselves, just called everyone Nahuas, or, even more broadly, Indians or Amerindians. It is also due to the Spanish treatment of grouping all the Amerindians together that the societal and cultural differences that existed in the pre-colonial period among various Nahuas and also other Central Mexican peoples got muddied and often coalesced in the colonial era. As historian Ramos Gabriela put it, an important change that marked the colonial period was that indigenous intellectuals had to negotiate the Spanish idea of the colonial Indian, because the Spanish just put them all together. All of this makes their interpretation of the colonial sources even harder, as they can represent the collage of traditions from various pre-Columbian peoples. Yes, there were codices that did talk about the history of other peoples or tribes than just the Mexica. For example, Codex Xoltl, that, even though talked about the history of the entire Valley of Mexico, focused more on the people of Texcoco rather than the Mexica. However, just a few generations after the conquest, the tradition of separate peoples or tribes living in central Mexico mostly died out, with larger cultural and ethnic groupings forming, like that of the Nahuas, or again, even more broadly, the Indians/Amerindians, and the colonial written histories, even though some more than others, reflected this change. On top of dealing with this cultural and ethnic nuance of the sources, we also have to deal with the fact that many codices, like the Florentine Codex, were written by native Nahuatl speakers, but under the supervision of Spanish friars. In case of the Florentine Codex, it was Bernardino de Sahagún. Therefore, whether this codex represents the genuine information of a native Nahua population or a heavily edited version of it by a Spanish friar is unknown. And many other codices, like Codex Mendoza, were written in a similar context. This colonial context should, however, not always be considered bad. For example, a Dominican friar, Diego Duran, who grew up in Mexico as his family moved to the colony very early after the conquest, knew Nahuatl as he grew up there. He was also friends with many local Nahuas and interviewed many elder Nahuatl speakers for his book, The History of the Indies of New Spain. During his time, he was even criticized for being too favorable to the natives. So as always, there's a lot of problems with the sources, but there's also some good in them, which makes the whole thing of relying on them that much harder, because we cannot simply disregard them, but also have to be very careful with what we take from them. This is, for example, the reason why I did not talk about any specific numbers of how many sacrifices were conducted per year by the Mexica or the whole Valley of Mexico in general, because with the nature of the sources, it is really hard to tell. There definitely were human sacrifices and cannibalism happening in pre-Columbian Central Mexico. The sheer amount of written and archaeological evidence for that is unquestionable, but extrapolating numbers of victims being sacrificed every year from that is really hard. Lastly, it is prudent to mention that the Spanish weren't the only ones that altered sources we rely on today. The Mexica did the same thing. King Itzcoatl, who ruled over the Mexica from 1427 to 1440, destroyed most of the early historical codices of the Mexica people and of their conquered subjects, because he said it is not wise that all the people should know the histories. Itzcoatl did this right after he came to the throne of Tenochtitlan and secured the independence of the Mexica people from their enemies. Therefore, his action of burning books can be interpreted as a way of solidifying a single national historical narrative, which might not have been
also very, very common. I remember that aforementioned Chinese historical iceberg video. I mean, the exact same thing happened with another Chinese emperor with another emperor, where he like he was like, well, in order to unify the nation, I gotta destroy all contradicting texts and narratives.
Completely true.
And
It is also
this goes to show that the Aztecs and other Amerindian people were just normal ass human beings, and were despite the kind of luridness of the human sacrificing all that, they're still very very normal, doing it all for very normal human reasons and in very normal human ways.
this event that proponents of the political argument point to when they talk about the creation of an imperial cult that drove the large
This is
of
great
sacrifices
evidence for that
conducted by the Mexica.
reading
So,
the
to
situation.
summarize, the history of the Mexica people, or the Aztec Empire in general, that we know today and that is presented in books and channels like mine or Invicta, is a history that was altered by King Itzcoatl, who was trying to build a national narrative, whose history largely survives in colonial Spanish sources that were written with their own biases, but all of that does not mean that all the sources are unusable. There are many facts and themes shared among all the sources. There are also genuine Nahua statements in many colonial codices, and by cross-referencing all this and using the historical method, we can reach a very well-informed understanding of not just the Mexica or Nahua societies, but of all the pre-Columbian Central Mexican societies. Through this, we can gain a much better picture of how these societies functioned and how they came to normalize, even though not fully, and ritualize the act of killing humans in a religious context. Before I say anything, go check out Stefan Milo's video. He's also talking about pre-Columbian sacrifices, but from a more archaeological standpoint. I have been working on this video in the background ever since I read the paper Mass Murder or Religious Homicide, Rethinking Human Sacrifice and Interpersonal Violence in Aztec Society, which was actually over a year ago now. However, the paper made me so interested in the topic that I decided I had to make a video on it, no matter how long it will take me to make, and here we are. 1 year later with an almost 40-minute video. I would highly recommend reading the pinned comment for this video, as there are still many things I didn't have time to talk about.
You heard it, man.
Like the ball
Check
game,
out that
for example,
pin.
or the fact that pre-colonial Central Mexican codices weren't really written.
Yep.
Or
the
the
whole
mess
this,
of a
but in
topic that is the
corrections.
pre-Columbian Central Mexican ethnic groups, etc. All of that is in the pinned comment. My entire bibliography, as always, is in my script, which you can download for free on my Patreon. Lastly,
this is extensive.
I'm pretty sure this video is not monetized, as YouTube is not happy with me talking about uncomfortable history in an educated, well-researched, and ultimately nuanced manner, because they do not promote proper educational content if it's uncomfortable. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, or getting my channel's YouTube membership for some extra stickers, or just buying me some coffee. Any help is appreciated, because I just spent a year on
like you said, this guy's dedicated as fuck. Ooh, okay, now this is very, For those who don't know, I'm an adult artist. I do a lot of stuff regarding erotica, so I'm always very interested in hearing about cultural I don't know, the evolution of various sexual cultures. So I'm going to definitely be adding that to my watch later. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to cover that up just in case YouTube is mad about even the censored version of it. But yeah, very, very interesting video. I was often a little too engrossed to really give much in the way of interesting commentary. But yeah, definitely, definitely thought it was, so I guess some of the highlights, yes. As always, these I guess indigenous terms, I don't know, these names of various cultures, things, they're always way more complicated than you might first assume. I'm imagining how someone who knows nothing about, say, Europe would have to try and wrap their head around the various different sundry cultures and countries, trying to figure out I thought of all this Europe. What do you mean there's Germany and Luxembourg and Scotland and Britain? What? This is all so complicated. But yeah, definitely just a lot of familiar trends in the video. I mean, yeah, I mentioned it several times. At the end of the day, this was just a video about people doing things that people have always done, just in a way that's unique and uh, you know individual to them, kind of thing. Like the classic like I guess trope of your society has some way for you to sacrifice yourself, and that it's good for society. It's good for the oftentimes the ruling class, even though it and there's usually some way that it gives like a kickback to your people, your family, your community. Like you get to go up social rank, or if you're a poor high school American, going to the military will help you, pay for college or get other kind of benefits. So even though you're coming back with like PTSD and maybe some other uh, either a visible disability in the form of like an amputation or something like that, or something less visible like say I don't know, hearing damage or something like that, or the aforementioned PTSD. It's supposed to make up for it with the benefits you get back from it. Obviously, that's a bit better than just like literally sacrificing your life in a way that's like basically unavoidable. But it's very similar things. Like just yeah, I mean, I definitely knew that the Aztec cultures were like the hegemony in the whole like Mesoamerican area, but I never really thought about the parallels, like how much it paralleled other hegemonies in our day and age. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why I keep trying to allude to things like this, like that, when I mean, I think anyone who's listened this far knows what I mean. Like it's very America coded, US of A sort of thing. Just uh, just translated back into a different culture with different uh, specifics and idiosyncrasies. But yeah, I mean, the use of, in the case of the Mexica, religion to justify imperialism and colonialism, whereas for us, it's more often than not the almighty dollar, the market and whatnot. And then finishing it out with which is always the historian's perpetual struggle of trying to get at the ground truth of history, of reality. And then you have to deal with the fact that the people who are writing history are oftentimes not at all interested in a accurate recording of the facts. They were just interested in recording and editorializing things in ways that were useful to the elites, or that were congenial to the elites. Because I mean, even if you yourself are not interested in sort of aiding and abetting the big cheese, you gotta think about what they will allow to exist at all, and then you gotta editorialize things with that in mind. But yeah, very, very interesting video. Thanks so much for watching. Consider liking, commenting, maybe even subscribing. And if you're feeling particularly generous and of age in your country of residence, try visiting these links up in the corner. Anyway, here are some more videos to check out, and until next time, take care.